I am Elijah Smith, and I will be your speaker today. We're going to be talking about the concept of agricultural exceptionalism when it comes to the law, agriculture, and food systems. So, this is going to be a unique concept that might be a little foreign for some. So, it's important to begin with a bit of an introduction of what we're talking about. What is agricultural exceptionalism? And this is essentially the phenomenon of agriculture being regulated differently as compared to other industries, in special regard to the way that agriculture affects labor and affects the environment, affects employees, and affects the way that goods are being sold, processed, and distributed throughout the United States. We're primarily looking at just the United States for this seminar. So we're going to take a brief moment at the end to look at the global supply chains, but the majority of this documentary will look at the United States when it comes to agricultural exceptionalism. Now, exceptionalism leads to large gaps in how they are rather how workers are being treated as compared to the agricultural industry and other industries, and we'll see that there are a lot of disparities between things like I said, labor, the environment, distribution, processing, and we're going to use the agricultural industry, comparing it to other industries, to really see how this concept of agricultural exceptionalism really ends up playing out in the real world. So, looking historically, there has always been a history of agricultural exceptionalism in the law. So long as there have been laws, there have been agricultural exceptions within the laws. And it's usually looked a lot like labor or environmental discrepancies. And particularly in the early 19th century, when it comes to the United States, there were a lot of discrepancies when it came to labor and how farm workers were supposed to be properly paid and how rather working conditions were supposed to be provided. And this was a really major problem in the history of the United States, especially in the early 19th century, when there were a lot of discrepancies in terms of how laborers were being treated. So that's sort of a historical example of what we're seeing in the agricultural industry in terms of historical presence of agricultural exceptionalism. Now, looking to the modern day, exceptionalism from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century has been present, and it's still the 21st century is still seeing a lot of the ramifications of the agricultural exceptional laws that are out there. However, there is work being done in order to ameliorate those problems that have led and come from agricultural exceptionalism. And laws and regulations like the Farm Bill is something that looks specifically at the agricultural industry to make sure that it is being well taken care of and that it is not necessarily overlooked. So we'll touch on that just a little bit later, but there are still aspects that of agricultural exceptionalism that affect the agricultural industry to this day. And we're going to talk about two major ways that we still see agricultural exceptionalism in the modern day, one of which is in agricultural labor exceptionalism. And we're specifically going to look at the way that workers are being treated on the actual farm that they're either harvesting or planting or helping maintain. So we're going to look specifically at the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, which specifically includes a couple different industries, one of which being the agricultural industry. And essentially, the Fair Labor Standards Act provides regulations that set rules for employers when it comes to minimum wages to pay for employees, overtime pay, child labor, and employee record keeping. These are four major protections that the FLSA provides for workers in industries that are not the agricultural industry. So this regulation essentially completely leaves out this large section of workers who primarily is either in minority populations, marginalized in some way, or potentially not citizens of the country. A lot of the labor coming in during the peak harvest season is migrant labor, which is not necessarily made up of documented people who come here for the work opportunities when it comes to harvest time. And because of the FLSA, even if they were to get to be a proper worker of the United States and get their citizenship and get naturalized, there wouldn't necessarily be any standards that their workers would have to follow in terms of protecting them while they are on the farm or when it comes to compensation either. So we're going to continue to talk about life on the farm. And instead of looking at the workers, we're going to look at how agricultural laws affect the environment. And we're going to take a couple decades step back and look at the Clean Water Act of 1972, which aims to protect local waterways and essentially protect the clean drinking water that we have, as well as protect the aquatic food systems throughout the country. This regulation looks specifically at point source pollution and regulates it extremely efficiently to make sure that pollution is not being spread out into the waterways and contaminating populations, leading to dead zones and things like that, which not only hurt the aquatic ecosystem, but can hurt the local economy in the surrounding towns and cities. So the Clean Water Act, like I said, looks at point source pollution, and essentially that you can consider this as being able to point to a large company or manufacturer that has a specific processing plant and identify that as a point of pollution. However, non-point source pollution is something that isn't covered in the Clean Water Act. And this is essentially a source of pollution that doesn't have one single identifiable cause. So we can look at this as, say, a group of farms in southern Missouri who are all inadvertently polluting the local water with use of chemical fertilizers. So there's a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen being leached into the water, and that water goes down the Mississippi River and enters the Gulf of Mexico and causes eutrophication, algal blooms, hypoxic zones, and then dead zones where nothing can survive, killing all of the aquatic ecosystem and thus making it so that fishers who are in the Gulf of Mexico to make a livelihood aren't able to do so. So this is something that is a huge example of environmental exceptionalism when it comes to agriculture that is overlooked by something like the Clean Water Act. So it presents itself in many ways, whether it comes to labor or environment. So exceptionalism certainly has effects on a lot of things, including the global supply chain. Now, the United States isn't necessarily known for their extremely proactive environmental policies. And as we're getting into an age where there is an emphasis placed on green living and green farming, green agriculture, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agriculture that doesn't have a negative effect on the environment or the people around the environment. The United States is being seen as this entity that isn't necessarily taking the war on climate very seriously because of these agricultural exceptionalism laws that are allowing more pollution and more negative harm to come to the environment. So in the global stage, this isn't necessarily a major issue now, but is likely to present itself as a major issue in the near future as there's more emphasis placed on making sure that the environment is going to be sound and available for future generations. So we're going to slowly start to wrap it up by talking about the Codex Alimentarius, which is essentially Latin for the food code. And these are standards for agriculture and food, which the both entities must follow, and this essentially ensures public health as well as food safety. And these are regulations that are meant to guide the world of food, making sure that food is produced in a safe way, distributed in a safe way, held in a safe way. And this code essentially looks at the way that different producers of food, and whether it be processing or in agriculture, can keep their food safe and thus public health safe. And essentially, there are a couple different agencies that the regulations of the codex really affect, and that's the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA, all of which in some way or another have to do with agriculture or the food that is being distributed in the United States. So we just wanted to end off with a bit of a justification for how a regulation like this can go into effect, different regulations related to food and agriculture. And we are still, like I said, seeing evidence of the effects of agricultural exceptionalism to this day when it comes to labor exceptionalism in agriculture, as well as environmental exceptionalism coming from agriculture. But I mentioned earlier the Farm Bill, and we're seeing the Farm Bill present itself as a saving grace in the world of agriculture, as it presents a very comprehensive plan and funds from a legislative point of view to boost the world of agriculture and propel it forward to a more advanced state of being. And in order to help both the environment, the workers, and consumers, it provides different titles that go over things like nutrition and commodity crops and different things like that, that all aim to help the world of agriculture and those that interact with the world of agriculture. This is just a couple of sources that were talked through during this documentary. So I have been Elijah Smith, and thank you very much for your time. Cheers.